Questions? Question orale. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Not too long ago, the Prime Minister said that inflation was going down. And his Finance Minister said that deficits would add oil on the fire of inflationary flames. And that's exactly what she did a few weeks later in her budget, with $60 billion in inflationary deficits added. That means $4,000 roughly extra for each Canadian family. Today, we've learned that inflation is up. When will the government reverse its inflationary policies of this Prime Minister? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that inflation is going down. It was 8.2% in June, and we have learned that it's now 4.4%. That's a big difference. And the Bank of Canada forecasts 3% inflation over the summer and less than 3% by the end of the year. With respect to our budget, we will be keeping our AAA rating. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. She is the one who said that deficits add to inflation. In fact, she said that inflation and interest rates hikes are related to deficits, the same type of deficits that she would be creating a few weeks later in her budget, $60 billion in inflationary deficits. And now, 1 out of every 5 Montrealers in the Prime Minister's city can no longer pay their monthly bills. Therefore, will the Prime Minister finally give a bit of a break to Montrealers and Quebecers by eliminating these deficits? The Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, once again, the Conservatives do not want to talk about the truth of the Canadian economy. And the reality is that Canada has the strongest economy of the G7 nations, and we also have the best fiscal position. We have the lowest deficit in the entire G7, and that is thanks to the work of Canadians, that we have an unemployment rate that is very low and inflation that is going down. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Minister told us that inflation was falling, and his Finance Minister said that she would avoid deficit spending because that would simply pour gasoline on the inflationary fire. Well, she did pour $60 billion of new inflationary fuel on the fire, and as a result, today we see inflation is rising again, led by higher mortgage payments for the average Canadian. Will the government stop pouring fuel on the fire so that Canadians can afford to pay their bills?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
You know, Mr. Speaker, yet again, despite the best efforts, which actually aren't that good, of the Conservatives to mislead Canadians, the Canadian economy is strong. We have the strongest fiscal position in the G7, and our AAA credit rating was reaffirmed after I tabled the budget. Now, on inflation, I know the party opposite doesn't really know too much about the Bank of Canada, but the Bank of Canada follows CPI trim and CPI median. Those are the core indicators. And CPI median and CPI trim went down between March and April.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Actually, when I said that deficits would cause inflation 2 years ago, that was controversial. Now everyone agrees I was right, including the Governor of the Bank of Canada, who now says inflation is caused by deficits, and the Finance Minister has agreed that I was right when she said that deficits pour fuel on the inflationary fire, and she poured $60 billion of that fuel. That's $4,200 per family. Mr. Speaker, Canadians cannot afford to eat, heat, or house themselves. Will that minister stop pouring the fuel on the fire so that Canadians can, again, pay their bills?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I have a another request, and that is, will that ex-minister stop leading Canadians astray and urge them recklessly to invest in crypto? That's an area where we actually really do disagree. Now, I want to talk about the core inflationary measures that the Bank of Canada follows that determine the path of interest rates. One of them is CPI trim. CPI trim peaked at 5.6% in June of last year. It was 4.4% in March and fell to...
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Actually, the Governor of the Bank of Canada said that his measure of inflation is CPI. CPI is up today, even though she said it would be down. It's up, interestingly, after her $60 billion in new spending that she brought in her budget. What's up the most, though, is mortgage payments, and she can tell us why, because she admitted that deficits make inflation worse and force rates higher for longer, end quote. Force rates higher for longer, and that is why Canadians are paying 28% more in mortgage payments. Mr. Speaker, will she get off the backs of Canadian home buyers so that they can put a roof over head?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians know better than to listen to this leader of the opposition when it comes to money, because he did, after all, urge them to invest in crypto. And they know better than to rely on this leader of the opposition when it comes to the Bank of Canada, because his answer is to fire the independent governor of the Bank of Canada. Now, what the Bank of Canada looks at is CPI trim and median. CPI median peaked at 5.2% in June. It was 4.5% in March and went down to 4.2% in April.
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, they called their plan the Century Initiative. It wants everyone to be Anglophone. I am interrupting the Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. There are conversations taking place on both sides of the House, and we cannot hear the question.
Questions going on across the floor, and I can't hear the question from the Honourable Member. Alors, je vais demander à...
So I will ask everyone.
Calm down, take a breath. L'Honorable Député de Belleuil-Chambly.
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly, from the beginning. The government agreed on something called the Century Initiative that we won't translate into French because it doesn't deserve translation, because we'll all speak English one day anyway. It's a slogan. They're saying they don't want 100 million Canadians by the end of the century. We all agree on that. But they're going to keep the $500,000 target for new immigrants every year. And that is what is going to shrink Quebec. And does the government really think that, and the Deputy Prime Minister really think that Quebecers are that stupid? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I would like to be very sincere and frank with my Bloc colleagues and with all Quebecers. For our government, and for me personally, French in Canada is very important. As is the Quebec nation, it's a priority for us. We understand the importance of linguistic and cultural vitality in Quebec. And I have to say that for me, as the finance minister, the Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly, we have expression in Quebec, Mr. Speaker, that says basically, and I'll explain it one day, you have to walk the talk. Nevertheless, this government made a mistake with respect to its immigration file, and they're behind. They can't manage the foreign student file. They cannot manage the foreign workers file. And in a year and a half, they haven't been able to do this. So what would lead us to believe that in a year and a half, they're going to become good enough to manage a file with 500,000 new immigrants a year? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I would like to continue by saying that we truly believe in Quebec, and we truly believe in the importance of the Quebec nation. And this is why we are investing in the French language across the country. And it's also why we're investing in Quebec's economy. We're investing in healthcare. We're investing in early child care and daycare. And we're investing in the green industry plan. All of these things are a priority for Quebecers, and they are also our priority. The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
Question for the Minister for Housing. I want to give an example of a single mom with 2 kids in the City of Toronto paying the average rent, which is $3,300 a month for a 2-bedroom, earning an average salary, which is in Ontario, $62,000 a year. How much money would this single mom with 2 kids have left over after paying her rent to buy groceries for her kids?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, helping that single mother with 2 kids is a priority for our government. That is why we have invested in early learning and childcare and brought the fees down by 50%. That's right. That is why the grocery rebate is so important, and I'm glad people will get their checks on July 5th. I absolutely agree with the member opposite that housing is a very significant challenge for Canadians. That's why I'm glad we've delivered on the tax-free first-time home buyer savings account. That's why we have guidelines to protect Canadians with mortgages who are facing...
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
The answer is $470. Yeah. Not very much. Let's take another example of a single mom with 2 kids in Vancouver, earning an average income in the City of Vancouver and paying the average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment, which is $3,800 per month. How much money would that single mom have left over? The answer is she wouldn't have anything left over. That's how serious things are in this country for renters. People are not earning enough to pay their rent. So when will this government understand how serious it is and do something about it?
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as the member opposite knows very well, supporting families with children is one of the greatest priorities of our government. And for that single mother in Vancouver, childcare fees coming down by 50%, that is meaningful. For that single mother in Vancouver, depending on the age of her children, she could be getting $12,000 a year through the Canada Child Benefit. I bet that helps. Now, I do agree we have more work to do on housing. That's why I'm glad in the budget we created an additional $4 billion to implement a co-developed urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy.
Member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
The government should stop arguing amongst itself. Liberals have delivered many gut punches to Canadians over the past 8 years, including their failed carbon tax scam, a housing crisis, and $1.2 trillion in debt. This morning, Canadians woke up to another one because the finance minister has no fiscal restraint, and her $63 billion budget bonanza gave Canadians another inflation rate increase. This finance minister gave every struggling Canadian household an extra $4,200 of cost because of her failed budget. What did she think was going to happen when she threw a $63 billion jerry can of fuel on the inflationary fire that she started?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let's talk for a minute about fiscal responsibility and about inflation, which is coming down. In terms of Canada's fiscal position, the truth is, moving past the overheated and frankly, metaphorically challenged conservative rhetoric, Canada has the strongest fiscal position in the G7. Our AAA credit rating was reiterated by S&P after I tabled the budget. We have the lowest deficit in the G7, Mr. Speaker.
Just going to wait till all the chirping goes down. There's some chirping going back and forth, and it's just the odd voice, and it's making it very difficult to really concentrate on the questions and the answers. So we all want to hear what the question is. We all want to hear what the answer is. Let's all stay quiet and listen. The Honourable Member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
The Finance Minister must be practicing dodgeball with the Prime Minister the way they duck, dodge, and deflect questions in here. They sound like a broken record on that side, but not as broken as what Canada feels like after 8 years of their failures. This Finance Minister just gave $4,200 of debt on struggling Canadian households, and she made the inflation rate go up. And now she looks like she's auditioning for her next career. This isn't a part-time job. If she doesn't want to do her job anymore, why doesn't she just get out of the way so Conservatives can fix everything that they broke?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I am standing in this House right now doing my job, and it is a privilege to do it. And Mr. Speaker, I was in Japan last week at the meeting of the G7 finance ministers, where we talked about the global economy, where we talked about continuing to support Ukraine against the illegal Russian invasion, where we talked about economic security in the face of an aggressive China. And I was proud and privileged to represent Canada there. Are the Conservatives proposing that finance ministers should not attend meetings of the G7?
Before I go to the next question, I just want to, we've been noticing there's a few members who have been banging on their desks. That's loud, and it's difficult for the interpreters to begin with. We want to be as friendly to our interpreters. After all, without them, it would make it very hard for us to conduct business. The honourable member for Thornhill.
Bad news, Mr. Speaker. Canadians are seeing even higher inflation today. Now we know for sure, again, that Liberal deficits drive Liberal inflation. And the finance minister's last budget is driving every Canadian household $4,200 more into debt. Where is the accountability? Where are her answers? And why does she talk to Canadians like they're in kindergarten? The effect of her own failures is playing out right in front of her very eyes. Does she not see what everybody else sees?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the people who talk to Canadians as if they're in kindergarten are the Conservatives. The Conservatives behave as if Canadians do not understand that the judge of Canada's fiscal responsibility is not overheated Conservative rhetoric. The judge is the ratings agencies, and they have reaffirmed Canada's AAA rating. Conservatives do not understand that we, in fact, have the lowest deficit in the G.
I'm sorry. It's just that chatter that's going on. Maybe go back about 15, 20 seconds and start from there, about three-quarter way, if you don't mind.
I don't mind at all, Mr. Speaker. So Canadians understand that Canada has a very strong fiscal position. We have the lowest deficit in the G7. Our AAA rating was reaffirmed by S&P after I tabled my budget. Canadians also understand that contrary to what the member opposite suggested, it's not the government that sets interest rates. It's the Bank of Canada. And the Bank of Canada looks at CPI trim and median, both of which went...
Honourable member for Thornhill.
The judges of the Canadian economy are the families who cannot pay their bills. The finance minister's budget of broken promises speaks to her own credibility. She told Canadians that we would see a declining debt to GDP ratio, a line that she would not cross. She crossed it. She projected an eventual surplus. She spent $60 billion instead. She told Canadians that she would balance the budget in 5 years, and now it's never. And today, again, inflation is on the rise. That means everyone in Canada pays more for everything. She is not the victim. Canadians deserve answers, and when will they get them?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, what we see day in, day out as the world reels from the effects of a pandemic, when we deal with the global effects of inflation, where Canada is doing better than the G7 average, the G20 average, and they can yell across as much as they want, Mr. Speaker. But the difference is we have a finance minister who's trying to protect and ensure that children get dental care, that we have an opportunity when we're dealing with child care, and that's what they're talking about, Mr. Speaker, is cutting these programs. So they can attack, they can be partisan, that's what they do, but underneath it, it's about cuts, it's about not being there, and it's misrepresenting world events.
The honourable member from Mégantic-L'Érable. It's the finance minister herself that said spending too much drives up inflation. There were 20 Liberal members and even the Prime Minister that represents the Montreal region, and their track record has been terrible. We're talking about thousands in Montreal. 1 out of every 5 families don't have enough money to pay their rent and meet their basic needs. The situation is so terrible that Marie Leblanc has said that suicide is just around the corner. She said that in La Presse. People are having a hard time paying their rent? Why is the minister turning their backs on them? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, it's important to reiterate that our budget is responsible fiscally. And it is S&P that has reiterated our AAA rating. But with respect to everyday Canadians, our government is looking out for their interest and investing in families. It is our government that is investing in health care. It isn't the Conservatives that want to cut. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-l'Érable, her responsible budget? Well, no member in the Greater Montreal region rose to answer that question. Inflation is up again. They're driving up the price almost everything on basic needs. Interest rates have meant that construction starts are dropping, and that means more and more people will have a hard time making ends meet. And no members from Montreal are speaking out against the Prime Minister's inflationary measures. When will the minister understand logic and stop sending more and more Montrealers to food banks? The Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage, Mr. Speaker, the government knows that a lot of people are going through a hard time right now, and that's why we're being present through various programs for daycare and health care and all aspects. And the question, well, is that Conservatives are used to turning their backs on Canadians because it's nice to say that we're spending too much. Well, when they mean that, they don't want programs, helps for seniors, help for young people and families and lodging. Which one of these programs would they cut? The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Mr. Speaker, let's talk about Chinese interference. The Globe and Mail revealed on Saturday that CSIS has contacted at least 2 other MPs who may have been threatened by Beijing in 2021. That's at least 3 elected members of this House who were known targets, and none of the 3 were informed until now. That's serious. Mr. Speaker, it was hard enough to believe that the member for Wellington Halton Hills was not informed, but now 3 MPs? I mean, come on, it's unbelievable and unacceptable. Why did the Prime Minister withhold this information for 2 years? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety, Mr. Speaker, I share my colleagues' concerns, and that is why the government, with the help of CSIS, will continue to offer briefings, and that is why in the 2023 budget, we do have federal resources to create a coordinator to fight against foreign interference, and that is why we have set aside additional resources for the RCMP to protect all Canadians. We have to protect our democratic institutions, and that is the work not only of the government, but all members in this House. The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're going to committee that will create a committee to think about a plan. Well, it's normal for elected officials targeted by intimidation or foreign interference to be informed, but it's not normal for them not to be informed when their loved ones may be threatened. Learning about the news 2 years after the fact raises even more questions for the Prime Minister. First, of course, is why did the government not inform them sooner? But also, very coincidentally, we're talking about 2 Conservatives and 1 NDP member. If they had been on the right side of the House, would they have been informed at the proper time? The Honourable Minister of Interparliamentary Affairs. Mr. Speaker, like my colleague has indicated, we take these threats of foreign interference very seriously, particularly when we're talking about elected officials in this House. And that's exactly why, Mr. Speaker, we gave instructions that are clear and precise to agents to make sure that when members or senators have been threatened, that this information is provided, and we'll make sure that these elected officials are informed and that measures are taken. The Honourable Member for Laurentides-Laballe. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are still waiting for their rapporteur. But what other option do they have aside from recommending an independent public inquiry? There are no other options. 3 MPs have been threatened by China. A Liberal is facing allegations of Chinese interference. And interference is in the news every day. Mr. Speaker, It's clear there is a case to investigate. At this point, waiting for the rapporteur is nothing more than a waste of time. Unless we're trying to buy some time here. When will we see a public and independent commission of inquiry? The Honourable Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. Speaker, on the contrary, we are working to make our democratic institutions safe. We have been working hard since we created our government to strengthen the necessary measures to fight foreign interference, something that the Conservatives have never done in the years previous when they were in power. We are still seeking other measures to further strengthen the measures that are in place, and we are waiting impatiently, like our colleague, from the report from the Honourable David Johnston in this respect as well.
Andy Royal.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals' Bill C-75 entrenched the catch-and-release bail system that is devastating Canadian communities. Violent crime has shot up 32% under this Prime Minister's watch. Premiers, police officers, and victims groups have been desperately calling on this government to fix their broken bail system. But the bill they introduced today is nothing more than a slap in the face. It will not keep repeat violent offenders behind bars. The Liberals' catch-and-release system remains in effect. When will these Liberals finally end catch-and-release for violent criminals?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question, as misguided as it is. Mr. Speaker, I had the honour today to introduce in this House Bill C-48, which represents targeted measures to strengthen our bail system, Mr. Speaker, in order to meet the concerns raised by provincial premiers, by our counterpart justice and public safety ministers across Canada, by police associations and others. Mr. Speaker, let me read to you what Tom Stamatakis, president of the Canadian Police Association, has said. We appreciate that the ministers have worked collaboratively with stakeholders and introduced this common sense legislation that...
The Honourable Member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Mr. Speaker, the fact remains that minister celebrated when the Liberal government's catch and release policies were brought in by Bill C-75. We need an entire overhaul of the Liberal system that created the violent crime surge across the country and led to the deaths and the harm of innocent Canadians from violent repeat offenders. Right. But the reality is the only way this gets fixed, the only way that violent repeat offenders get jail and not bail, the only way that the rights of victims are put first is with a Conservative majority government, Mr. Speaker. Isn't that right?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that on the other side of the House they believe that complex criminal justice policy resolves itself into a simple, silly slogan. That's not true, Mr. Speaker. You resolve complex problems in criminal justice by working with provinces, by working with territories, by working with stakeholders.
I'm sorry, the chirping is starting again, and it's starting to get a little bit loud. I'm going to ask the Honourable Minister to start over again so that everyone can hear the answer, please.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that on the other side of the House, justice policy resolves into a simple, silly slogan. But that's not the case. It's complex. You have to work with provinces, territories, experts, police associations, and that's exactly what we've done. Mr. Speaker, let me tell you what John Reid, who's the president of the Toronto Police Association, has said. Ensuring public safety maintains its confidence in the administration of justice is paramount, and I believe the introduction of Bill C-48 and the clear message being sent by the government that public safety remains a top priority will help victims of crime as well as all Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, since Bill C-75 was adopted by the NDP Liberal coalition, criminals no longer fear law enforcement because they know they'll be released the same day. We're currently celebrating Victims and Survivors of Crime Week, but since 2015, under this Liberal government, it seems to be the era of repeat offenders, with victims coming second. They need to correct the monumental mistake that is Bill C-75. Will they do it? The Honourable Minister of Justice. Today, we're tabling a bill, to really work with provinces and territories and with police associations across Canada to strengthen our bail system in Canada. Mr. Speaker, allow me to read what Tan Stammark said today. We appreciate that ministers worked in cooperation with stakeholders to present this bill that meets the concerns raised by our members. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. All the government's trying to do is fix the mistakes that they made in the past. C-75 was a mistake. They're trying to fix it, but they haven't fixed it. C-5 is a serious mistake, too. All this government does is make mistakes that create problems throughout the system of public safety. Can the minister confirm today that the bill that he tabled will actually fix the problem? Yes or no?
L'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, as I've said many times, our justice system and our criminal system can't be reduced to a simple slogan. If we want to improve the system and make sure that Canadians can trust the system, we need to work with the provinces and the territories and stakeholders and police associations. That's exactly what we've been doing, Mr. Speaker. It's what we've done for C-75, and it's what we've done for C-48. That is the government's approach, and it will bear fruit. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, an environmental disaster is currently unfolding in Kanesatake. Toxic water is leaking from an illegal dump onto the Mohawk territory, and it's flowing into the Lake of Two Mountains. The smell is appalling, and the damage is real. Members of the community can't take it anymore. They're living in fear, and they're getting no support from the government. Federal intervention is urgently needed. Will the Liberals hear Kanesatake's cry for help and launch a parliamentary inquiry to find out the exact causes of this disaster? The Honourable Minister.
Indigenous Services Canada, indeed the federal government, has been working with Kanesatake leaders to determine a solution to move forward in a way that protects the health and safety of the community. We agree that we must do better to protect our lands together, and that's exactly what I'm doing with leadership of Kanesatake.
Excellent. The Honourable Member for Hamilton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, Windsor families are worried. There are 2,500 good-paying union jobs at risk at the new Stellantis plant because this Liberal government can't seem to get its act together. They're pointing fingers at the province for fighting instead of fighting for working-class Windsor families. This government can't say that they stand with workers and then play political games on their livelihoods. They need real leadership now. So when will this government get back to the table, live up to its commitments, and finally make Windsor workers a priority?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no government has invested more for our car sector and our auto workers than our government. We proved that with the NAFTA negotiations. We proved that when we got Canada carved into the U.S. EV incentives, and we proved that with the VW investment. We're doing the same thing with Stellantis. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? We're going to ensure a fair deal for Canadians across our whole country. And that does mean that Ontario needs to do its fair share, and it means that Stellantis needs to do its fair share as well.
Excellent. The Honourable Member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mr. Speaker,
it's
easy to make up empty slogans and unrealistic promises. It is harder to do the work diligently, concretely address a complex issue in order to protect Canadians and ensure our justice system is fair and efficient. Can the Justice Minister update this chamber on the bail legislation he promised in March and actually introduced today? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member from Vaughan Woodbridge for his hard work on this issue. Mr. Speaker, Canadians deserve to be safe and they deserve to feel safe. That's why I introduced today Bill C-48, a targeted bail reform bill to address violent repeat offenders, gun and knife violence, as well as gender-based violence. It's the product, Mr. Speaker, of collaboration with the provinces and territories. We've had input from mayors, police, parliamentarians, as well as Indigenous leadership and the legal community. And, Mr. Speaker, the police associations are already reacting favorably. It's proof of what we can do when Canadians work together.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Liberal inflation has sent food, housing, and gas prices soaring, but there's one substance that has gone down in price by 90%. Powerful opioids. After the Prime Minister announced $100 million.
I'm sorry. I'm going to interrupt the Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Can you start from the top? We're just getting some distractions from all over. From the top, please. Order.
While the Prime Minister has sent inflation for gas, heat, and groceries soaring, there is one product that's actually come down in price: powerful opioids. The Prime Minister has spent $100 million on so-called safe supply. One Global News reporter went into the street to find out where all these drugs are going. Turns out they're being resold to other addicts in order to raise the money to buy deadly fentanyl. Will the Prime Minister cancel the dollars for drugs and instead put the resources into treatment for addicts?
The Honourable Minister for Mental Health.
Mr. Speaker, we are pretty fed up with this fight against evidence-based programs that actually are saving lives. We cannot allow the Conservatives to take us back to the failed ideology of the past. Even Harper's advisor, Ben Perrin, thinks they're speaking nonsense. So just stop it and save lives.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker.
Order. Order. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
No common sense. The evidence is seen in the tragic faces of addicts who lie overdosed on the pavement in the downtown east side of Vancouver, where after this Prime Minister spent $100 million handing out free drugs to addicts, he has led to a 300% increase in overdoses. Will he stop giving dollars for drugs and instead follow my common sense plan to put the resources into treatment and recovery to bring our loved ones home drug-free?
The Honourable Minister. Order. The Honourable Minister.
People are dying. Save.
One second. Order. 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 One person at a time in this chamber, please. The Honourable Minister.
46,000 overdoses have been reversed in safe consumption sites. That member says that he will stop that. I want him to speak to the parents of the people that would have been lost if there weren't safe consumption sites and safer supply. This is ridiculous.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland Colchester. Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
That people are dying because that minister and this Prime Minister are flooding the streets with dangerous drugs and killing these people. Since they brought in this policy, there has been a 300% increase in drug overdose deaths. 30,000 people have lost their lives. Investigative journalists have shown that the drugs that she is funding with Canadian tax dollars are flooding the streets and being sold for $1.
Order. 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 I'm hearing yelling on both sides. Please. The Honourable Member for, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition from the top, please, so we can hear the whole question. And I don't want to hear any screaming or shouting in the background. And then we can hear an answer as well. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
People are dying because the policies of this Prime Minister are killing them. His policies are flooding the streets with drugs that now go for $1 a hit. You can buy 26 hits of hydromorphine, which is an analog to heroin, for $30, Mr. Speaker. These are drugs paid for by Canadian tax dollars under a program by this government that has led to a 300% increase in drug overdose deaths. Why won't they get some common sense, end dollars for drugs, and put our people in treatment?
The Honourable Minister for Mental Health. Order. The Honourable Minister for Mental Health.
People have to stay alive long enough to get treatment. People are dying because of a toxic drug supply. Safe supply allows people to stay alive long enough. It means that in the CMAJ study just
Order. Please start from the top, the same courtesy I gave to the opposition leader.
People have to stay alive long enough to get to treatment. People are dying because of the toxic, tainted drug supply. When people are on safe supply, the CMAJ article yesterday talked about less drug use, less overdoses, less petty crime. This is an evidence-based project and program that it meets the test of evidence and science, not a journalist who only will speak to the people who disagree with him.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The theory is that if you flood the streets with hydromorphine, an opioid, that then people won't use more dangerous fentanyl. The reality.
Okay, we want quiet on both sides. We want to go back and forth. I just want everybody to take a deep breath, and we want to hear the question as well as the answer. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition from the top, please.
The theory is that if Prime Minister puts $100 million of hydromorphine on the streets, that people won't use more dangerous drugs. The reality, in both reports from the National Post, the Globe and Mail, and the data from the ground, is that the addicts are taking the hydromorphine, selling it to kids, taking the profits to buy fentanyl, dying of overdoses. The kids then get bored of the hydromorphine, and they take deadly fentanyl. That's why people are dying. Will the government stop the policies that are killing people and put our people in treatment instead?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, some things are just beyond the pale. Our Minister of Mental Health is one of the most respected members of this House. Unlike the Leader of the Opposition, who is a career politician and has done nothing else, she is a doctor. She devoted much of her life to delivering babies and bringing forth life. I heard the Leader of the Opposition shout across the aisle, "You are killing them." Shame. That is shameful. That is entirely unacceptable.
L'honorable député d'Avignon-Lamétis.
The Honourable Member for Avignon-Lamétis-Matane-Matapédia.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister of Environment announced consultations to establish his plan to meet the biodiversity targets set at COP15. But at the same time, the same minister, there's still a lot of shouting across the aisle.
Talking, really, just loudly. And it's not a place where you have a conversation while somebody else is talking across the floor. So listen to the one person who's speaking. If you really want to speak to each other, you can either cross over and whisper or go into the hallway. L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Minister of the Environment announced consultations to establish his plan to meet the biodiversity targets set at COP15. But at the same time, the same minister authorized the oil company, BP, to begin exploratory drilling in the heart of the most significant marine area on the East Coast. Mr. Speaker, the minister says he wants to protect marine areas, but at the same time, he's authorizing drilling in those same marine areas. It's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And yet, he must know that drilling for oil is not the way to protect marine areas. The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. It gives me the opportunity to remind this House that no other country on this planet was ready to move forward to host COP15. Canada was there. It stood up for the international community, for science, and for the protection of nature. And we succeeded where everyone thought that we would fail. We succeeded in getting an international agreement signed, and it was historic. This is what Canada does to protect nature. The Honourable Member for Avignon-Lamitie ce matin, Matapédia. Mr. Speaker, this government has approved the auctioning off of 14 drilling permits that encroach on the most important marine area off the East Coast. If the Minister of the Environment doesn't see the contradiction in allowing drilling in areas that are supposed to be protected, then who knows how far he'll go to pander to the interests of big oil. Or maybe he can tell us, if being designated a marine protected area doesn't protect against oil drilling, what does? What are they protected from? Real estate speculation?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, we're talking about oil production, not oil drilling. Now, when we were elected, less than 1% of our oceans were protected. Now it's over 14%, and we're targeting 30% by 2030. On the same subject, I could talk about when the leader of the bloc was Minister of the Environment in Quebec. At the time, he defended oil exploration and oil drilling on Anticosti Island. He said that the government of Quebec had the intention of moving forward with drilling in that area.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland-Colchester.
Mr. Speaker, it's utterly shocking that this Liberal government believes the only treatment for addicts in this country is palliative care. No other treatment required, just move straight to palliative care. Since this reckless plan using taxpayer dollars for high-potency drugs was introduced, 7 people a day, Mr. Speaker, 7 a day in January alone in BC have died. The overdose crisis cannot be fixed by giving people more drugs. It's only making it worse. When will this Liberal government realize that the Conservative common sense plan to give addicts rehabilitation and not free drugs is the way to end the overdose crisis?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Canadian drug policy and international drug policy have all 4 parts: prevention and education, harm reduction, treatment, and enforcement. We lived through 10 years of this Conservative government taking harm reduction out. We are now having to build back. And as Ben Perrin has said, rehashing Conservative war on drug tropes that have long since been discredited and have been found not to be only ineffective, but costly and deadly.
The Honourable Member for South Surrey White Rocks.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says that spending tax dollars to give free hard drugs to addicts is safe. He is wrong. Instead, he supercharged the drug crisis that is killing our sons and daughters. 7 dying in BC a day alone. There is no time to wait. We need a common sense plan that saves lives. Stop flooding our streets with crack, heroin, and cocaine. Addicts need rehab, access to treatment beds, and a path to a drug-free life. The Prime Minister is out of touch, and our youth are at risk. Will he do what it takes to bring home our kids drug-free?
Yeah! The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we can't allow the Conservatives to take us back to the failed ideology of the past. Our government will use every tool at our disposal to end this national public health crisis. Supporting safer supply is just one of the evidence-based comprehensive public health responses to the toxic drug and overdose crisis. It does include prevention and treatment and enforcement. Our government is working with stakeholders to help support safer supply and build that evidence, like the recent CMHA study around this promising practice and life-saving practice.
Honourable Member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, even though this situation has been raging across BC and all of Canada, Canadian parents and families are concerned by this issue. What we've seen, Mr. Speaker, is that for years under the Liberal government, the situation has been getting worse. Not only is it not getting better, but it's getting worse. They must notice that it's time for a new approach, an approach that's based on common sense. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank my colleague from Quebec for the question. I think, like me, he knows that there are people in my riding and across Quebec who are working to save lives through treatment, early intervention, harm reduction, and also through supervised injection sites. These are people that I would invite my colleague to visit. Many of them are in Quebec City. Their approach is very different than the ideology of his leader. They're there to help people. The Honourable Member for Madawaska, Restigouche. Mr. Speaker, at COP15 last December, Canada and 195 other countries adopted a landmark agreement called the Global Biodiversity Framework in Montreal. Its goal is to protect nature around the world and to reduce the loss of biodiversity. The Minister of the Environment launched the consultations for Canada's 2030 strategy. Can the Minister tell us more about those consultations? The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for his question. Canada is indeed showing leadership by being one of the first countries to develop and implement its national 2030 biodiversity strategy and to kick off the consultations. I'm proud not only to launch these consultations with Canadians, but also to deliver on our promise to protect at least 30% of Canada's land and water by 2030. Furthermore, we launched consultations to add certain species to the species at risk list. There's still a lot of work to be done. The time to act is now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Surrey White Rock.
The so-called safe supply policies of the Liberal NDP coalition are deadly. 7 people a day are dying in BC alone. Unsafe tent cities abound. Kids are being sold the safe supply drugs and overdosing at an alarming rate. Then users have the cash to buy deadly fentanyl. Our sons and daughters are paying the price. When will these Liberals make treatment beds a priority, not free hard drugs, so we can bring home our loved ones drug-free?
Yeah. The Honourable Minister for Mental Health.
Mr. Speaker, once again, I will quote from Ben Perrin, the Public Safety and Justice Advisor to former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. There is no indication that prescribed safe supply is contributing to illicit drug deaths. Safer supply has been tested and found to be beneficial for people who have been unable to have treatment for whatever reason and are long-term substance abuse users. We talking about essentially substituting a contaminated street drug with a drug that has known contents and potency to help people stay alive, first of all, and also to be able to stabilize.
Honourable Member for Cumberland Colchester.
Mr. Speaker, the careless attitude that this Liberal government has taken towards the overdose and addiction crisis in Canada is unacceptable. In British Columbia alone, as I mentioned previously, Mr. Speaker, 7 people a day are dying in January. We have heard the Liberal Addictions Minister refer to the reckless distribution of hard drugs without mandatory treatment as a, quote, necessary step. When will this Liberal government listen to science and realize that their decriminalization experiment is a failure and give addicts rehab, not free drugs, and bring our loved ones home?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it is impossible to bring your loved ones home if they're dead.
Order. Order. Please continue.
The toxic drug supply means that people in construction, in the mines, are using once and dying. We have to move to a safer supply of drugs like we have with alcohol and cannabis and the other ways that people actually use substance to numb their pain. Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper's advisor said, as particularly people using drugs as props. I was really disgusted by it. I hope I was so disturbed to see Pierre Poilievre.
Next question. I was order. The time had run out long before. I just want to remind the honourable members when they're referring to someone, refer to them by their titles or their writings. I know it gets emotional in here and we forget sometimes, but I just want to remind everyone on all sides. No. I have another name here, but the person isn't standing up, so I'm not sure if that's very good. The honourable member for Essex.
Mr. Speaker, this government continues to disrupt people's lives and cripple companies like WestJet. The Labour and Transportation Ministers have once again failed to bring union and management to the table. Now Canadian travelers may be stranded over the long weekend. The Prime Minister's high taxes and high inflation continue to destroy this country while our air pilots are leaving to work abroad. Mr. Speaker, our pilots are vital. When will the ministers do their job and ensure our pilots are back in the cockpit?
Honourable Minister for Labour.
Speaker, right now the employer and the union are at the bargaining table. They are trying to reach an agreement, one that is going to work for everyone. Our federal mediators are very good at what they do. Last year they resolved 93% of federal disputes without any work stoppage. Right now they are focused on the bargaining table, and so am I. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Scarborough Agincourt.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians across the country are concerned about foreign interference, and we know that diaspora communities are especially vulnerable. Chinese Canadians worry about the impact on the local community and about friends and family abroad. Canadians I have spoken to want real solutions. Can the Minister of Public Safety share what the government is doing to protect and assure Chinese Canadians and indeed all Canadians?
Well, Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I want to begin by thanking my colleague for her work and her leadership on this issue. Obviously, any form of foreign interference is unacceptable, and we have a concrete plan that is focused on prevention, on protection, and accountability, including and up to expelling foreign diplomats when they cross the line. But we're not stopping there. We're going to continue with the creation of a foreign agent registry, Mr. Speaker, but we're going to do it in the right way so that communities are not stigmatized or marginalized. We're going to do this work to protect Canadians, and we need to do that work together.
The honourable member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Mr. Speaker, the leader of the NDP and I heard from BC municipal leaders about the need for more reliable and affordable public transit in Metro Vancouver. The mayors have a strong plan for necessary transit expansions, but this Liberal government is putting that plan at risk by delaying promised funding until 2026. Commuters are the ones who pay when the Liberals delay. Workers, students, seniors, and people living with disabilities deserve timely, accessible transit now. Why are the Liberals holding back this crucial funding from communities?
The Honourable Minister for Intergovernmental Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague for her question. We share her concern about accessible, affordable public transit. It's good for the environment. It helps families in terms of commuting, to getting to important jobs that they need to attend to. I'm looking forward to meeting later this afternoon with the TransLinks mayors from the Greater Vancouver area. It's an ongoing conversation. I'll draw to my colleague's attention, Mr. Speaker, that a $3 billion permanent public transit fund is exactly what the Canadian Federation of Municipalities asked for. We've put that in place, and we'll continue to work with mayors from British Columbia and across the country to make sure this works well.
The honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to building new passenger rail between Toronto and Quebec City, it would seem that the fix was in. Faced with the heady choice between privatization and, wait for it, privatization, you'll never guess what the Transport Minister chose. Documents show that the minister didn't even consider a public model before he decided to hand Via Rail's busiest rail corridor over to private investors. Why is this Transport Minister so fixated on privatizing this country's public passenger rail system?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable member for his good work that he does on the Transport Committee together with me. Canadians deserve reliable railway service, and public funds are. Excuse me?
publicly.
I want to remind the honourable members that usually when a person asks a question, you answer it. You don't have a conversation with someone else. It just doesn't work out. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, you have 15 seconds left. I'll let you finish up.
Mr. Speaker, we will always make sure that there's appropriate funding in our budgets and in our programs to make sure that Canadians have the public rail service that they deserve.
Hear, hear.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for question period today. C'est tout le temps que nous avons. It being 3:19, pursuant to order made on Thursday, June 23rd, 2022, the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motions